Thank you, Isaiah, for reading so capably for us this morning. We appreciate that. We're thankful for each one who is here today. We're glad that you have come out to be with us. We hope that you will stay around and enjoy the fellowship meal with us following services this morning. I am thankful for this opportunity to be able to speak to you this morning. I always appreciate the opportunity to get to share God's word with folks, and I hope that what we talk about this morning will be beneficial to each of us. From the time that I was a very young boy, I've always loved stories. Don't you? Recently on a Wednesday evening service, one of the speakers in the Berean series that we're doing on Wednesday evening in our adult class mentioned how that stories are such a great way for us to learn, and they're such a great teaching tool. And the stories from the Bible, and so many of those come from the Old Testament, are just stories that we can retain in our minds, and we can recall things about them, and they can build us up, they can encourage us when we get down. And so this morning, we want to talk about one of the great Bible stories from the Old Testament. It's the story of Joseph. And you can read about Joseph starting in Genesis chapter 37, and then from Genesis 39 clear through the end of the book of Genesis is the story of Joseph. There's so many great and wonderful lessons that we could bring out about Joseph. It's a story that shows that regardless of how many setbacks we have, how many things seem to go against us in this life, and Joseph certainly had a lot of things go against him in this life, we're never forgotten by our God. God always remembers his own, and God always looks after his own. Now, I'm sure there were some times in Joseph's life when he was questioning, God, are you really paying attention here? Are you really seeing what's happening to me? But Joseph always maintained his faith in God, regardless of the setbacks that came about. And God certainly delivered Joseph ultimately from all of those things. The story of Joseph is a story that shows how we can forgive even the greatest things, or the worst things, maybe is a better way of saying it, that people do to us. Sometimes in life we are hurt, and we're generally hurt deepest by those who we're closest to, members of our own family. And Joseph was hurt deeply by members of his own family. And yet Joseph showed that he could forgive, and that through love he could overcome the things that were done to him by his own brothers. Sometimes brothers and sisters in the church hurt us. Maybe I could say oftentimes brothers and sisters in the church might hurt us. And we might think, well, I just am never going to have anything more to do with them. I would ask you to always keep Joseph in mind if you had that thought, because Joseph showed, I can forgive these brothers regardless of what they did to me, regardless of how they mistreated me. I can still forgive them, and I can still show the love of God toward them despite all that has happened. And the story of Joseph shows how that God has a plan and a purpose. And his plan and his purpose will get carried out. And we don't always see from the beginning exactly what God's plan is. But in hindsight, we could look back and see how things that happened in our lives or happened around us were all part of God's ultimate plan for the salvation of mankind, and specifically for the salvation of our own families often. And this is certainly true in the story of Joseph. But the part of the story of Joseph that we want to focus on this morning comes from Genesis chapter 44 that Isaiah read a few verses to us about. And just briefly, let's get the setting for this. Joseph has been sold by his own brothers, the 10 older brothers, the sons of Jacob, into slavery in the land of Egypt. He's mistreated. He's taken advantage of by others. He's thrown into a prison for something that he didn't even do. And ultimately, after years of this, Joseph, through the providence of God, rises to a position of power in the kingdom of Pharaoh. At this time, Egypt was the great power of the world. And the Pharaoh of Egypt, it probably could be argued, was as powerful as any man on earth at this time. And Joseph became second in command to Pharaoh, even though he'd started out as a Hebrew slave in an Egyptian dungeon. And Joseph rose to prominence, and through God's power, Joseph foretold a couple of dreams that Pharaoh had, which was what got him promoted to the position of second in command. And in those dreams, God revealed to Pharaoh, then Joseph foretold, that there would be 7 years of great plenty. Harvest would be abundant in the land of Egypt. And the grain would just grow and produce until you couldn't count all that you had. But after those 7 years of great plenty, there was going to be 7 years of tremendous famine. And in God's words, through Joseph, the plentiful years are going to be totally forgotten by how lean and how poor the 7 years of famine are going to be. Well, the 7 years of plenty came about just as Joseph had told. And Joseph, through his wisdom given to him by God, said, we're going to store up grain in the years of plenty. And we're going to have that so that when the famine comes, there'll be food for the people of Egypt to eat. But there was so much grain grown in Egypt in those 7 years that Egypt became the breadbasket for the rest of the known world. There was grain in Egypt enough to sell to even countries round about. Jacob believed that Joseph, his beloved son, had been killed by a wild beast. Jacob believed that because of the deceitfulness of the 10 older brothers who made him believe that when they had actually sold Joseph as a slave. In the land of Canaan, the famine hit just as hard as it did any place else. And when all of the food in Canaan was gone, Jacob said, I have heard that there is grain down in the land of Egypt that could be bought. And so he said to his 10 older sons, go down to the land of Egypt and buy grain. And so these 10 older sons, the very ones that had sold their brother Joseph into slavery, traveled down to the land of Egypt to buy grain. And who is standing there in the position of the seller of the grain but Joseph? Now Joseph, looking like an Egyptian ruler, is not known by his brothers, but he recognizes them, and they come and bow themselves down and ask to buy grain. Joseph, in a masterful plot on his part, has to determine if the old bitterness and hatred that they had shown towards him still exists. But more importantly, Joseph has to find out, do they hate my younger brother Benjamin, who was his full brother? These 10 were his half brothers, different mothers. do they hate my brother Benjamin? And will they treat my brother Benjamin with the same kind of hatred and animosity that they treated me with once our father Jacob is dead? And so Joseph accuses his brothers of being spies. Now, when they're put on the spot and they're nervous, he extracts a lot of information out of them that they don't even realize at first what he's doing. You're spies. No, we're not. Yes, you are. No, we're 10 brothers from the land of Canaan. Well, if you're 10 brothers, is this all of you? No, our father's still alive. There's some information that Joseph wanted. After 22 years since he last saw his father Jacob, he finds out Jacob's still alive. And we have one younger brother who's still alive back in the land of Canaan. Another piece of information is gleaned. Benjamin, the younger brother, is still alive back there with his father. But Joseph pushes. No, I don't believe you. And the only way that you're going to prove to me that you're not spies and that you're not lying to me is you're going to have to bring your younger brother down here to the land of Egypt for me to see. You see, Joseph knew that if they hated Benjamin the way they hated him, that once Jacob was out of the way, they could kill Benjamin. They could do it to him anything they wanted to by force. They'd done it to him. And so Joseph knows if they feel that way, I need to know it, and I need to be able to get Benjamin down here in Egypt with me where I can protect him. And so his plot says, you go back. I'm going to keep one of you, Simeon, here in prison, and you'll never see my face again unless the next time you come back with this younger brother you claim you have. Well, they go back home with the grain. They tell their father's upset because they're telling him that they have to take Benjamin back the next time. He says, that won't happen. And so as long as there's grain, Jacob and the 10 of them seem to forget about it. But once the grain's gone, Jacob says, you need to go back to Egypt and buy some more grain. And the brothers speak up and say, we can't go back to Egypt unless you let Benjamin go with us. Jacob says, I'm not going to do it. My life is bound up in the life of this boy. You know how much I love him. You know that Joseph, my beloved, was evidently killed by a wild beast. And if something should happen to Benjamin, if you take him to Egypt, I'd go down to my grave in sorrow. I could never recover from that. Well, hunger eventually gets the best of Jacob, and his thoughts change. Judah says to him, Dad, we're not going back to Egypt unless you send Benjamin. Now, I'll stand in the place of Benjamin. If anything happens to him, I'll be your servant. I promise, Dad, I will protect this young boy, this young man, with my life. That's quite a difference from what we saw in Genesis chapter 37 regarding Joseph. They hated Joseph. They envied Joseph. They wanted him out of the way. They said, let's kill him and throw his body into a pit in the wilderness. They didn't show any concern for Joseph, but now we see concern shown by the older brothers for Benjamin. Jacob relents, and the boys go back to Egypt with Benjamin in tow. Once again, they stand before Joseph, and Joseph sees his younger brother Benjamin. But the test isn't completely over. He has gotten Benjamin into Egypt, but now he has to see, do these brothers really care about him? And if not, I'm going to make sure he stays here in Egypt with me. And so Joseph comes up with a scheme that we read about in chapter 44 of Genesis. He says to the master of his house, to the steward of his house, they're leaving tomorrow morning. Fill their sacks with grain. But unknown to them, you put my cup, my silver cup that represented the royalty of Egypt, so to speak, the cup by which Joseph was identified as second in command, the cup by which Joseph divined things in the sight of the Egyptians. He said, you put my cup in the mouth of the sack of the youngest brother, which was Benjamin. You put the money in the sacks that they brought to pay for grain, and you tell them, out, leave, go back to Canaan. And so, early in the morning, these 11 brothers, the 10 older brothers and Benjamin, are sent away with sacks of grain, and unknown to them, the master's silver cup is in Benjamin's sack. Then, after they're out of the city, Joseph says to his steward, now, get a posse together and you pursue them. And when you catch up with them, you tell them, one of you has stolen the master's silver cup. So they think they're out of Egypt. They think everything is good. They're on their way back home. Benjamin is in tow. Simeon, who was kept a prisoner, is with them. They've got grain in their sacks. And the brothers think things are well. And then here comes the posse. And the steward accosts them and says to these brothers, what have you done stealing the master's silver cup? No, 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 they say. We are not thieves. We would never think of stealing the silver cup of the man who's the second in command of all of Egypt. And they even go so far as to say, listen, this shows they were convinced they were innocent. Listen, whoever you find in possession of that silver cup, you kill him, and the rest of us will be your servants forever. You don't make those kind of comments if you know you're caught and guilty. They were sure they were innocent. And so the steward says, and Joseph later repeated it, no, listen now, innocent people aren't going to be punished here, but the one person in whose sack we find the master's silver cup is going to be the servant to Joseph for life. Well, confidently, all 11 of them say, have at it. Examine our goods. And so they begin with the oldest. And they open the sack of Reuben. Nothing. Then Simeon, then Levi and Judah. There's no silver cup. Then Dan, and then Naphtali, and then Gad, and then Asher. There's no silver cup. Then Issachar, and then Zebulun. There's no silver cup. And can't you just about at this time see them saying, see, we told you. We're honest people. But then the sack of Benjamin is opened, and there is the silver cup. The brothers are devastated. They prove that all of the animosity and all the hatred and all the resentment towards Jacob's favorite sons is gone now. The steward says, I'm just taking this youngest one back with me. He's the only one that's going to be the servant. And all 10 brothers say, no, we're all going back to Egypt with him. They all go back, and in an impassioned plea, they fall before Joseph and say, please, please don't keep this boy as a servant. Let him go back home. There's a mistake that's been made, obviously, but please, you don't realize if we don't go back, if Benjamin doesn't go back home, Our elderly father is going down to the grave in sorrow. Now they actually care about Jacob too. You see, when they did the things to Joseph they did many years before, they deceitfully made Jacob think that Joseph was dead all these years. Now they're showing true remorse and care for Benjamin. And so Joseph has finally seen that the old bitterness is gone and that there's concern on their part. And so Joseph reveals himself to them, and there's a wonderful reunion in chapter 45 of Genesis that is must read. But this morning we're talking about the master's silver cup. You know, when the brothers were accused of stealing, they had not stolen Joseph's silver cup. They hadn't. The steward had put it there, unknown to them. They were accused of being thieves, and they resented that. And all of us resent it when somebody says, "You're a thief," and we know we're not. But you know what? Joseph's brothers had stolen from Joseph. Oh, they didn't take his silver cup. But I submit to you, those brothers had indeed stolen from Joseph. They'd stolen from Joseph time. Joseph was 17 years old when they sold him as a slave into the land of Egypt. He was 30 years old when he stood before Pharaoh. He'd spent 13 of the best years of a person's life, from 17 to 30, as a slave and as a prisoner in a dungeon. And that was directly due to the actions of his brothers. No, they hadn't stolen the silver cup, but they had stolen time from their brother Joseph. I submit to you that they had stolen Joseph's rightful place as the Lord of Jacob's house. Jacob intended for Joseph to be the Lord, the master of the estate when he was gone. He was going to be the son who would get the double portion. And Jacob had that right to do that. That was why the coat of many colors was significant. He was showing really to all of the brothers, this is the one that I'm picking out. I love him. He's the oldest son of the wife of my love, Rachel. And so I want him to